Please, ma'am. My grandson hasn't eaten since yesterday morning. I'll mend your fence, every last post of it, for 1 cup of milk. That's all I'm asking. Not money, not a bed, just milk for the boy. The old man said it's slow and careful, the way a man sets down something heavy that he's afraid to drop. He had one hand on the strap of the sack that hung off his shoulder, and the other resting light on the head of the child, standing pressed against his leg. The sun was going down behind him, low and orange over the road he'd walked in on, and it threw his shadow long across the dirt so that it climbed the steps of the porch and stopped at the hem of the woman's dress, as if even his shadow was too worn out to come any farther. Ruth Calloway did not answer him right away. She stood at the top of her porch steps with her arms crossed, over her chest and her back, near straight against the peeling white post. And she looked at the two of them the way you'd look at weather coming in off the fields, not with meanness, but with the careful, tired watchfulness of somebody who had learned the hard way that most things that come up your road come to take something from you. Her hair was pinned back off her face, gone grey at the temples, and her dress was the plain grey-brown of a woman who had stopped dressing for anybody a long time ago. In her right hand, hanging down at her side, she held a glass bottle of milk, still cool from the spring house, the cream risen thick at the neck of it. She had come out onto the porch to bring it in for the evening. She had not expected to find anybody standing at her fence line at supper time. "I don't know you," she said at last. It wasn't cruel. It was just true. "No, ma'am, you don't." The old man dipped his head, almost a bow. "Name's Amos Hartwell. This here's my grandson, Eli." He gave the boy's shoulder the smallest squeeze, and the boy looked up, not at Ruth, but up at his grandfather, the way a child checks a face to know whether he ought to be afraid. "We don't mean you any trouble. I saw your fence was down along the north side there, and the gate's near come off its hinge, and I thought there might be a trade in it." Ruth's eyes went just for a second to where he was pointing. The fence along the north pasture had been leaning for 2 winters. 3 of the posts had rotted at the ground and gone over, and the rails lay in the tall grass like the ribs of something that had died there. She knew exactly how long it had been down. She knew it every time the wind came up, and she lay awake listening for her cow, worrying the animal would push through and be gone by morning. There had been no man on this place to fix it in 6 years, and she had not had the money, nor the strength, nor, if she was honest, the heart to fix it herself. She looked back at the old man. And now, in the failing light, she saw him better. He was thin, the way old men get thin when they've been giving their food to somebody else. His shirt had been a good shirt once. You could still see it in the cut of the collar. But it was grey with road dust now, and worn near through at the elbows. And it hung off him like it had been made for a bigger man he used to be. His boots were cracked across the toe and tied with twine where the laces had given out. There was a tremble in the hand that held the sack strap, a fine, constant tremble he was trying to hold still. And when he shifted his weight, she saw him catch his breath and press his lips together, quick, like a man stepping around a pain. He didn't want anybody to notice, but it was the boy that undid something in her. Eli couldn't have been more than 6. He was small for it, small and quiet, with a shirt 2 sizes too big, knotted at the waist with a bit of rope, and his trousers were caked to the knee with the red dust of the road. His face was smudged, and his hair stuck up in back where he'd slept on it, and his eyes were the thing, big and dark and ringed underneath, the way a child's eyes go when he's been hungry, longer than a child ought to know how to be. He wasn't crying. That was the part that reached in past Ruth's arms, folded over her chest, and took hold of her. He wasn't fussing or begging or putting on for her benefit. He was just standing there against his grandfather's leg, looking at the bottle of milk in her hand, and trying, you could see him trying, not to look at it. He'd drop his eyes to the porch boards, and then they'd drift back up to that bottle, slow, like a needle finding north. And then he'd catch himself and look away again, and swallow, a child who has been taught not to ask. There is nothing in this world quite so hard to look at. Ruth felt her jaw tighten. "Where's the boy's mother?" she said. "His people?" She hadn't meant it to come out sharp, but she had lived alone a long time, and living alone will do that to a voice. Put an edge on it that the heart underneath never intended. The old man didn't flinch from it. He'd been asked hard questions before, you could tell. "It's just us now, Mom," he said quietly. "Just the two of us on the road. His mama?" "That was my daughter. She passed this spring." "And his daddy?" Amos stopped. His eyes went for a moment to something over Ruth's shoulder, off toward the darkening east, and whatever he saw there put 10 more years on his face. "His daddy didn't come home from the war. Went over in 43. They sent us back a flag and a letter, and that was the end of it." He looked down at the top of the boy's head, and his voice dropped so low, Ruth almost didn't catch it. "So it's me looking after him, and I aim to do it right, for as long as the Lord leaves me the wind to do it with." The word war landed in Ruth Calloway's chest like a stone dropped down a well. It went down, and she felt it strike bottom somewhere she kept covered over. Somewhere she did not let herself go anymore, and she had to look away from him, out at the fence, at the road, at anything, while it settled, because she knew that flag. She knew that letter. She had one folded in a cedar box at the bottom of a drawer she didn't open, and a gold star that had hung in her front window until she couldn't stand the sight of it and took it down. Her Daniel had gone over in 43 too. And her Daniel hadn't come home either, but she didn't say any of that. She wasn't a woman who handed her grief to strangers on the porch. The war took a lot of people's boys, was all she said. Her voice had gone rough. "Doesn't make you special. Or him." "No, ma'am," Amos agreed, gentle as ever. "It surely doesn't." The sun had dropped another finger's width, and the first of the evening cool was coming up off the ground. Somewhere behind the house, Ruth's cow lowed, low and patient, wanting to be brought in. Off in the pasture, a whip-poor-will started up its long, lonesome call. The old man shifted his weight again, and again she saw him catch that breath, and this time the boy looked up at him worried, and reached one small, dirty hand up and took hold of a fistful of his grandfather's shirt. Like he was checking the old man was still standing. That did it. That small hand closing on that worn-out shirt. "The fence isn't a one-evening job," Ruth said abruptly, before she'd rightly decided to say anything at all. 3 posts are rotted clean off. You'd need to dig them out, set new ones. That's not a cup of milk job. That's a fool's bargain, and you know it." Amos met her eye, and for the first time, something almost like a smile moved at the corner of his mouth. Not a beggar's smile. Not a grateful, groveling thing, but the small, dry smile of one working person recognizing another. "It's a 2-day job if a man knows what he's doing," he said. "And I know what I'm doing, ma'am. 40 years I built wagons and barns and fences from here to the county line before my hands went on me. I can set you posts that'll stand after you, and I are both gone. All I'd ask is you let the boy have his milk tonight, and let us bed down in your barn out of the weather, and I'll work off every drop and then some. You won't owe me a thing. I'll see to that. I don't take what I haven't earned. I never have." Ruth stood there a long moment. The sensible thing, the thing 6 years of living alone and watching every penny and trusting nobody had trained into her, was to say no. To say she was sorry, but she was a woman alone out here, and she couldn't have strangers in her barn, and there was a church in town 3 miles back that fed people, and God bless, and good evening. That was the safe answer. That was the answer that kept the door shut and the world out, and Ruth Calloway exactly as alone tomorrow as she was tonight. She looked at the milk bottle in her own hand. She looked at the boy looking at it, and she thought, though she'd have died before she said it out loud, of another dark-eyed boy, 30 years back, who used to stand on this very porch waiting for his cup of milk before bed, back before the war, back before the flag and the letter, back when this house had voices in it. "There's a dipper by the pump," she heard herself say. Her voice came out flat, like she was setting terms on a hard bargain and not doing a kindness at all. Because if she let it be a kindness, if she let herself feel it as a kindness, she was afraid of what else might come loose. "You'll wash before you eat off my dishes. Both of you." The barn's dry on the south end. There's clean straw in the last stall. And I'll thank you to keep out of the loft. The ladder's rotten. She came down one step and held the milk bottle out, not to the old man but past him, down to the boy. Here, go on. Eli didn't move. He looked up at his grandfather. Go on, son, Amos said softly. The lady's giving it to you. And the boy came forward, careful on his thin legs, and took the bottle in both hands the way you'd hand a child something made of glass, because it was. And he tipped it up and drank, the cream and all, his throat working, his eyes closing, and a thin white line running down his chin in the last of the orange light. He drank like a boy who had learned that food was a thing that came and went and you took it while it was there. When he finally came up for air, he stood there breathing hard, holding the half-empty bottle against his chest, and he looked up at Ruth Calloway with those big, dark eyes, and he said in a small, hoarse voice, the first words she'd heard him speak, "Thank you." Ma'am Ruth had built a wall around herself brick by brick for 6 years, and she felt the first brick of it come loose right there on her own porch steps in the going down of the sun. At the sound of a starving child remembering his manners, she turned away quick so neither of them would see her face. "Barn's that way," she said. "Supper's at full dark. Don't be late, I don't hold plates." And she went up her steps and into her house and shut the door. And she stood a long while in the dark of her own front room, with her hand pressed flat against the wood, listening to her heart go, wondering what in God's name she had just let onto her place. And why? After 6 years of keeping the whole world on the far side of that fence, she had opened the gate, out in the yard. The old man eased the sack off his shoulder like it weighed as much as he did, and lowered himself down onto the bottom step with a slow, careful breath. One hand going to the middle of his chest and pressing there a moment till the tightness passed. The boy came and sat close against his side. Together they watched the last of the light go out of the sky over the broken fence, the fence Amos Hartwell had already promised. In his heart would be the finest piece of work his ruined hands ever set their hand to, because Amos Hartwell had a secret. He hadn't told the woman, and he wasn't going to, not yet, maybe not ever, if he could help it. He wasn't looking for a cup of milk. He was looking for a home to leave the boy in before the thing pressing on his chest finally pressed the last breath out of him. And he had walked 11 counties looking and been turned away from everyone. And now here, at the last, at a leaning white house with a broken fence and a hard-eyed woman who carried the same grief he did folded up in a drawer she wouldn't open. Here, Amos Hartwell thought he might, at long last, have found the place. He just didn't have much time left to make her see it. Ruth Calloway did not remember. The last time she had set 3 plates, she stood at her stove with her back to the room and stirred a pot of beans that had been meant to last her 4 suppers. And she watched the little that was in it and did the arithmetic that a woman alone always does. How much, and how long, and what it costs. And she made herself stop doing it. She cut the last of the cornbread from the morning into thick pieces and laid them in the skillet to warm. And she took down the crock of butter she saved for company she never had, and she scraped a good yellow curl of it onto each piece. And she did not let herself think too hard about why. Through the window over the wash basin, she could see them out at the pump in the blue dark. The old man had rolled his sleeves and was working the handle for the boy, and the boy was scrubbing his face and neck the way children do, which is to say badly, and the old man was saying something to him low. And once, just once, she heard the boy laugh. A short, surprised sound like laughing was a thing he'd half forgotten how to do, and it had caught him off guard. It carried across the yard and in through the window, and it went straight through Ruth Calloway. Like a needle through cloth, she had not heard a child laugh in this yard in 30 years. She turned back to her beans. When they came to the door, Amos knocked, though it stood open, and waited on the threshold with his hat in his 2 hands until she said, "Well, come in. I'm not going to serve you on the step." They came in careful, both of them. The way people come into a house that isn't theirs, Amos ducking a little, though he didn't need to. the boy staying tight in the old man's shadow, his damp hair combed flat with water and his face pink and shining from the scrubbing. They stood just inside the door and looked at her table like it was set for the governor. "Sit," Ruth said. There and there they sat. Amos folded his big ruined hands on the edge of the table and bowed his head. And the boy did the same, quick copying him. And Ruth stood there holding the skillet of cornbread and realized they were waiting on her, waiting to say grace, and she felt her face go hot. She hadn't said grace over a meal in 6 years. She'd stopped the same week she took the gold star out of the window. She had decided, in the black months after the letter, that she and the Lord had said about all they had to say to one another, and she'd left it at that. But the old man and the boy sat with their heads bowed at her table, waiting, and it would have taken a harder woman than Ruth Calloway to make them wait long. "Lord," she said, and her voice came out stiff and unpracticed, "for what we're about to eat, amen." "Amen," said Amos, warm, like it was the finest grace he'd heard in years. "Amen," whispered the boy. She ladled out the beans. She gave the boy the biggest piece of cornbread and pretended she hadn't. And then she sat down across from the two of them at her own table, in her own kitchen, in the lamplight, and she watched two strangers eat. And something in the shape of the evening, 3 plates, the lamp, the quiet clink of spoons, another person's child at her board, reached so far back into Ruth's memory that she had to keep her eyes on her plate and eat slow and say nothing at all, because her throat had closed up and she could not have swallowed if she'd tried. The boy ate the way she'd known he would, careful at first, watching, and then when hunger got the better of manners, fast, both hands, the spoon scraping. Amos put a hand on his arm once. "Slow down, son, it's not going anywhere." And the boy slowed, ashamed, and Ruth said without looking up, "Let him eat. There's more in the pot." There wasn't much more, but she said it, and she got up and gave him more, and she watched the old man's eyes follow her when she did it. Quiet and grateful, and something else underneath the gratitude that she couldn't read and didn't try to. Amos ate slow himself. Slower than a hungry man ought to. She noticed he gave half his cornbread over to the boy when he thought she wasn't looking, and she noticed the careful way he moved, the way he'd set his spoon down and rest a moment between bites, with his hand drifting up toward the middle of his chest, and then catching himself, drifting back down. She noticed the grey in his colour that the lamp couldn't warm, and the fine tremble that came and went in his hands, and the way that once, reaching for the water, he went still for a 3 count, with his eyes shut, riding out something. Before he finished the reach, like nothing had happened. Ruth Calloway had nursed a husband through his last winter, long ago, before the war took her son. Back when she'd been a young wife, and death had seemed like a thing that happened to old people in their proper time. She knew what a body looked like when something inside it had turned against it. She knew that grey. She knew that hand going to the chest. She said nothing, but she saw. "You've come a long way," she said instead, when the boy was mopping his plate with the last of the bread. "A fair way," Amos allowed. "From where?" "East, county by county." He turned his cup slow in his hands. "Had a place once. Little place, nothing grand but ours, mine and my wife's, and after her mine and my daughter's. Lost it 2 winters back. Doctoring bills for my Mary. That was my wife. And then when she passed, there wasn't the money to hold it. And the bank's a patient animal, but it's a hungry one." He said it without bitterness, the way old people say the hard facts of their lives once the sting has worn smooth. "So it's been the road since. Working where there's work. A fence here, a roof there. Whatever these hands can still manage." He looked down at them, those big, cracked, trembling hands, with a kind of rueful fondness, like they were 2 old dogs that had served him well and were failing now. "They were good hands once, ma'am. You'd not think it to look at them." "I'd think it," Ruth said. "I've seen work. I know hands that worked." He looked up at her, surprised, and that dry smile came again. "Your husband," he said. It wasn't a question. Ruth's spine went straight. "What about him?" "Nothing, ma'am. Only a place like this doesn't run itself down in a season. This was a working farm once, and a good one. Good bones. Somebody set these fences square and hung these doors true once upon a time. I can see his hand in it all over the place. He said it gently, and then gentler still, and I can see how long he's been gone by what's fallen since. A man learns to read a place like a face. This one's been grieving a while. Ruth stood up so fast her chair scraped the floor. "You've eaten," she said. The boy's near asleep in his plate. "The barn's ready. I'll thank you both to turn in." She started stacking the dishes, hard, the crockery ringing together, her back to the table so he wouldn't see whatever was happening on her face. "There's a lantern by the door. Mind you don't set my barn afire with it. Breakfast's at first light and I don't wait." She had let him too close. She saw that now. She'd let a stranger sit at her table and read her house like a letter over her shoulder, and the reading had gone straight to the one place she kept locked. And she was furious at him, at herself, at the whole soft, foolish evening. She'd known better. She'd known better for 6 years. You let one person in, and they see everything. And once they've seen it, they can hurt you with it. And Ruth Calloway had promised herself a long time ago that nobody was ever going to be able to hurt her like that again. Behind her, she heard the old man rise, slow. She heard him say, "Come on, Eli. Say thank you to the lady," and she heard the boy's voice, thick with sleep and a full belly, the sweetest and most dangerous sound in the world, to a woman who had shut herself away from sweetness on purpose. "Thank you for supper, ma'am. It was the best I ever had." Ruth stood at her wash basin with her hands in the cooling water and did not turn around until she heard the door close behind them and their footsteps cross the yard toward the barn. Only then did she look up and out the window and watch the little bob of the lantern light going away from her house through the dark, the old man's careful shape and the boy's small one, hand in hand. Crossing the yard, she had walked alone for 6 years. She stood there a long time after the lantern light had gone into the barn and settled and gone still. Then she dried her hands, and she took down from the high shelf where she kept the things she didn't use a second quilt, a good one, wool, that had been on her son's bed once, and she wrestled with herself over it for a full minute, standing there in the lamplight holding it against her chest. And then she cursed under her breath, soft, and she carried it out across the dark yard to the barn, and she set it just inside the door where the old man would find it. And she did not knock, and she did not call out, and she did not let herself look toward the last stall where she could hear the boy already breathing slow and deep in the straw. She just set the quilt down and went back to her house, quick, her arms wrapped around herself against the night cold, angry the whole way at how much she'd already given and how little it had cost them to take it. Behind her in the dark barn, Amos Hartwell lay awake in the straw with the boy curled warm against his side. And he heard the barn door, and he saw by the last of the starlight the pale shape of the quilt she'd left. And the old man lay there in the dark of a stranger's barn, and looked up at the black rafters, and pressed his hand against the deep, slow ache in his chest, the ache that was worse tonight than yesterday, and would be worse tomorrow than tonight. And he said so low it was hardly even a whisper, "Thank you, Lord, I think this is the one. I think we found it. Just give me the days to make her see it. That's all I'm asking. Just the days." Sunrise came grey and cool, and by the time Ruth Calloway came out onto her porch with her coffee, the old man was already at the north fence. He had the first rotted post dug half out of the ground. He'd found her tools in the lean-to without being told. Found the good ones, too, the auger and the tamping bar and the spade her Daniel had kept oiled and sharp that no hand had touched since. He worked slow. She could see that even from the porch. He worked slow, and he stopped often, leaning on the bar, his shoulders going up and down with his breath, one hand pressed to his chest. But he worked, and beside him, solemn as a little deacon, the boy Eli carried what he could carry. A single fence rail dragged through the grass, a bucket of water fetched from the pump held in both arms, spilling half of it on his own legs, helping the way a 6-year-old helps, which is to say, slowing the work down by half and making it worth twice as much for the doing. Ruth stood on her porch and watched them, and she drank her coffee, and she told herself she was only making sure the old man didn't ruin her posts. That was what she told herself. Now, before I go on, let me ask you something, friend, because I think a good many of you watching have stood right where Ruth Calloway is standing. Have you ever had somebody come into your life when you had shut the door on the whole world and known deep down that if you let them in, it was going to cost your heart something? Did you open the door or did you keep it shut? Tell me down in the comments. I read every one of them. And stay with me, because what Ruth Calloway is about to learn about the old man at her fence is going to change everything. For 3 days, Amos Hartwell worked that fence like it was the last thing he would ever build, and it was. The first day, Ruth watched from a distance and pretended not to. She found reasons to be in the yard. There was always a reason to be in the yard on a farm. The chickens, the wash, the kitchen garden that had gone half to weeds, and she moved through her morning finding those reasons, and every one of them happened to carry her to a spot where she could see the north fence line, and the old man bent over his work in it, and the boy trailing after him like a small, serious shadow. Amos worked the way old craftsmen work, which is to say, there was no hurry in it and no waste in it either. He didn't rush, and he didn't rest more than his body forced him to. He dug each post hole square and true, checking the depth against the length of his forearm, tamping the earth back around the new posts in thin layers, wetting it and packing it and wetting it again, so it would set like stone. He'd brought no timber with him, of course. A man walking the roads carries no lumber, so he used what the place had. He went through Ruth's lean-to and her fallen-down corn crib and her old collapsed hog pen, and out of the wreck of them he pulled the soundwood from the rotten, sorting it into piles with a carpenter's eye, and he made her new posts and new rails out of the bones of the things that had already died on her farm. Ruth watched him do it and felt an odd thing move in her chest, because it was exactly what a good man does with grief, isn't it? He goes through the wreckage of what's fallen, and he finds the wood that's still sound, and he builds something that will stand. She did not let herself think that thought all the way through, but it went through her anyway. By noon of the first day, the old man was grey to the lips. She saw him set down the tamping bar and stand a moment with both hands braced on the top rail, his head hanging, his breath coming in a way she didn't like the sound of even from across the yard. The boy stood next to him and put one small hand flat on the old man's back, not saying anything, just standing there with his hand on his grandfather's back. And Ruth understood, watching, that the child had done this before, that he knew the signs, that somebody had taught this 6-year-old boy to stand quiet with his hand on an old man's back and wait for the bad spell to pass, because that was a thing that happened now. In their lives, regular enough that a baby had learned the drill of it. Ruth set down her wash and walked out to the fence with a dipper of water before she decided to. "You'll drop dead in my pasture, and then I'll have the burying of you," she said, holding out the dipper. "Sit down before you fall down. The fence isn't going anywhere." Amos took the water. His hand shook so that he spilled a little. "I'm all right, ma'am," he said when he'd drunk. "Just the heat. It's not hot," Ruth said flatly. "It's the first cool morning we've had in a month, and you're grey as ash and sweating through your shirt. I've buried a man before, Mr. Hartwell. I know what it looks like when a body's fixing to quit on somebody. Sit down." He looked at her a long moment, and something passed between them then. She saw that he understood she'd seen, and he saw that she understood what she'd seen, and neither one of them said the word. But the word sat there between them in the cool morning air all the same. He eased himself down onto the grass with his back against a good new post, and the boy dropped down beside him instant, pressing close, and Amos put an arm around him, and Ruth stood over the two of them holding her empty dipper and not knowing suddenly what to do with herself now that she'd come all the way out here and admitted she'd been watching. "He's a good worker. The boy," she said, "for something to say. He is." Amos rested his cheek a moment on the top of Eli's head. "He's the best of us. Best of the whole line, this one. His mama was like that too, no quitting her right to the end. His arm tightened around the child. I mean to see he lands somewhere soft, Mom. That's the whole of my business on this earth now. Just that. See he lands somewhere soft. He's got you, Ruth said. Amos looked up at her, and he didn't say anything. He just looked at her with those tired old eyes, and let her hear the thing he wasn't saying. And Ruth Calloway felt the ground shift a little under her feet, because she'd walked out here with a dipper of water and walked into the edge of something she wasn't ready for. For now, Amos said at last. Quiet. He's got me for now. Ruth went back to her wash, but her hands weren't steady over the basin, and she scrubbed the same shirt a good deal longer than it needed. By the second day, the boy had attached himself to her. It happened the way these things happen with children, sideways and all at once. He'd been circling her since the first evening, the way a shy dog circles, coming a little closer each pass and darting off if she looked at him straight. But on the second morning, she came out to find him crouched at her kitchen garden, and he stood up guilty when he saw her, and she thought he'd been at her few tomatoes. And then she saw he'd been weeding. He'd pulled a whole row of pigweed and piled it neat at the end, working out what a garden was supposed to look like and setting hers to rights as best a 6-year-old could figure it. I didn't pull the good ones, he said quickly, anxious, when he saw her face. Grandpa showed me which is the good ones. These are the bad ones, see? He held up a fistful of wilted pigweed like evidence. I only pulled the bad ones. Ruth looked at the weeded row. Nobody had weeded that row in 3 years. You did it right, she said. And the boy's whole face changed, lit up from the inside like a lamp turned up, and Ruth had to turn away and busy herself at the pump because the sight of it did something to her she wasn't prepared for. Nobody had looked at Ruth Calloway like that, like her one word of approval was the finest thing that had happened to them all week, in more years than she could stand to count. After that, he was hers. He followed her the way he followed his grandfather, solemn and helpful, and always underfoot. He carried eggs from the henhouse in his shirt front one at a time, terrified of breaking them. He learned where the good hen hid her nest and led Ruth to it by the hand, whispering like it was treasure. When she milked the cow at evening, he sat on the stool beside her and watched, rapt, and she found herself Ruth Calloway, who had not explained anything to anybody in 6 years, explaining it to him. How you warm your hands first so the cow doesn't startle. How you squeeze from the top, not pull. How the old cow liked her forehead scratched and would stand quiet for it. And the boy drank it in like he drank the milk, greedy for it, and asked her 100 questions, and called her juice the third evening, without either of them noticing until it was already out of his mouth. Miss Ruth, can I do it? Can I try? Miss Ruth, not ma'am. Miss Ruth, she let him try. She sat with her hands over his small ones on the cow's warm flank and showed him, and he got a thin stream to hit the pail just barely. And he laughed that surprised laugh again and looked up at her. And for one unguarded second, Ruth Calloway smiled, really smiled all the way she hadn't smiled since before the letter. And Amos Hartwell, watching from the barn door where they didn't know he stood, closed his eyes and thanked God, because that smile was the thing he'd been walking 11 counties to find. Not a house. Not a barn, that. A woman with room left in her to smile at his boy like that. A soft place to land. The old man leaned against the barn door and let himself feel for just a moment how tired he was. How near the end of the road. He'd been holding it off by main strength. You can do that for a while. Hold death off by simply refusing to have time for it. But he could feel his grip slipping now, day by day, and he knew the arithmetic of it as well as Ruth knew the arithmetic of her beans. He did not have many days left. He had perhaps enough to finish the fence. He wasn't sure he had many more than that, so he worked, and he watched his boy fall in love with a lonely woman's kitchen, and watched the lonely woman fall in love right back and fight it every step. And he tended that fragile thing between them the way he tended his new posts, patient, careful, wetting the ground and packing it and wetting it again, building something out of two griefs that would stand after he was gone. On the evening of the third day, the fence was done. Part 4. The thing his hands built. It was a fine fence. Ruth walked the length of it in the last light, while Amos leaned on his tamping bar and the boy ran ahead of her along the line, one hand trailing on the new rails, proud as if he'd built every foot of it himself. And it was a fine fence. She could see that with an eye that had grown up on a working farm. The posts were set deep and plumb, so true you could have sighted down the line of them like a rifle barrel. The rails were squared and pegged, not just nailed but pegged, mortised into the posts the old slow way that took 3 times the work and lasted 3 times as long. He'd rehung her sagging gate on new iron, and it swung shut behind her with a small, sweet click, latching first try, the way a gate hadn't latched on this place in 6 years. She stood with her hand on the top rail of the finest fence she'd owned since her husband died. And she understood that the dying old man in front of her had given her, in 3 days, out of the ruins of her own fallen-down outbuildings, a thing that would stand and hold and keep her cow safe long after he was in the ground. "It'll do," she said, because she could not make herself say what she was feeling. Amos smiled that dry smile. "It'll do," he agreed. "That's not a cup of milk fence," Ruth said. Her voice had gone rough again. "That's not a barn and supper fence either. You've done 4 days' skilled work on my place, Mr. Hartwell, a wagon right's work. I owe you wages, and we both know it, and I don't like owing. You don't owe me a thing." He said it firmer than she'd heard him. "I told you at the fence line the first evening. I don't take what I haven't earned, and I earn my keep, and that's the end of the reckoning. The milk and the roof and your good cooking, that was the wage, and it was more than fair, and I'll hear no more about it." Then his voice softened. "You gave that boy 3 days of feeling like he was part of something, ma'am. 3 days of a garden and a cow and a woman's kitchen. You'll not know, I think, what that's worth. I couldn't buy it. I've been trying to buy it for 2 years with these hands, and I couldn't, and you gave it to him for the price of some beans." He had to stop. He turned his face away toward the pasture a moment. "So don't you talk to me about owing. The owing runs the other way, and it's a debt I'll die still owing and glad to." The word "die" dropped into the evening, and neither of them picked it up. "You'll leave in the morning then," Ruth said. It came out before she could stop it, and she heard the thing in her own voice, the thing she hadn't meant to let him hear, the small, bare crack of a woman who did not want them to go. Amos heard it. Of course he heard it. He'd been listening for it for 3 days. "I'd meant to," he said carefully. "Where?" "Wherever there's the next fence." He looked down at the tamping bar in his hands. "There's always a next fence, ma'am, as long as a man can still lift the bar. And when you can't lift the bar," he didn't answer that, and Ruth Calloway stood there in the going down dark at her fine new gate. And she felt 6 years of careful, hard-won, lonely safety balanced on the point of a needle. And she knew the way you know a storm is coming by the smell of the air, that whatever she said next was going to decide the rest of her life. She could say good evening and safe travels and God bless. She could keep the door shut. She could watch the little bob of a lantern go off down her road in the morning and go back to being exactly as alone as she'd been for 6 years. And safe and untouched and dead inside in the particular way that she had chosen and gotten used to. Or down the fence line. The boy had stopped running. He'd come back, and he stood now between the two of them, looking from his grandfather's face to Ruth's and back, the way a child looks when he can feel the grown-ups deciding something over his head that he doesn't have the words for, but can feel the weight of all the same. He came and stood close against Ruth's side. Not his grandfather's, Ruth's, and he took a fold of her grey dress in his small fist, the way she'd first seen him take hold of his grandfather's shirt on the porch 3 evenings ago. That first gesture that had cracked the first brick. And he looked up at her with those big dark eyes. And he didn't say anything at all. He didn't have to. Ruth put her hand down, slow, like it was moving on its own, and she rested it on the boy's head. on his soft combed flat hair, and she felt the small warm shape of him lean into her side, trusting, the way her own son had leaned into her side 30 years gone, on this very ground, under this very sky. The corn crib's fallen in, Ruth heard herself say. Her voice was not steady. She kept her eyes on the dark pasture and not on the old man, because she could not have said it to his face. And the barn roof leaks over the north stalls, and the porch step is rotten, and there's 100 things on this place that a woman alone can't get to and hasn't for 6 years. It's more than a season's work, it's more than a year's, she swallowed. A man could work a good long while on a place like this, if he'd a mind to. If he wasn't in a hurry to find the next fence. The silence stretched out long in the dark. "Mom," Amos said finally, and his voice was not steady either. "I'd not want to deceive you. You've seen my color. You've said yourself you've buried a man, and you know the look. I'll not take a place under your roof and let you build on me, and then leave you worse than I found you when I—" He couldn't finish it. He tried again. "I'm not a soundpost, Ruth. You'd be setting your fence line on rotten wood. And you a woman who knows better than most what that costs." And Ruth Calloway turned then, and looked the dying old man full in the face in the last grey light, with his grandson's hand fisted in her dress and her own hand resting on the boy's head. And she said the truest thing she had said to another living soul in 6 years. "I know what you are, Amos Hartwell. I've known since the second morning. I'm not asking you to be a soundpost." Her chin came up. "I'm asking you to stay long enough that this boy has somebody's hand to hold when the day comes that he needs it, and long enough that I remember how to be the kind of woman who has a hand to give him. That's the trade. That's the whole of it. You give me the boy and whatever days you've got left, and I'll give the two of you a home, and when the day comes—" Her voice broke, and she let it break and went on. "When the day comes, you'll not go into the ground a stranger being buried by a hard woman in a far county. You'll go from your own bed, in your own home, with your boy and me beside you. That's what I'm offering. Take it or don't, but don't you dare tell me it's a bad bargain, because I'm the one that's alone out here, Amos. And God help me, I don't want to be any more." The old man's face came apart. He'd held himself together across 11 counties. He'd held himself together burying his daughter and burying his wife and losing his home and walking his boy down every hard road in the state, getting turned away at every door. And he had not let the boy see him weep, not once, because a child needs to believe the ground he stands on is solid. But he came apart now in the dark at a stranger's new-hung gate, quiet, the way old men weep without much sound, just his shoulders going and the tears running down into the grey stubble of his cheeks. And the boy let go of Ruth's dress and went to him and put his arms around his grandfather's legs. And Ruth Calloway crossed the little distance between them and put her arms around the both of them. This old dying man and this small starving boy. These two strangers who had walked up her road out of the sunset 3 days ago, asking for a cup of milk. And that was how Ruth Calloway, who had let no living soul past her fence in 6 years, came to have a family again, at the very end of one man's road, and the very beginning of a boy's. She did not know yet what it was going to cost her. She only knew, standing there in the dark, holding the both of them, that for the first time since the letter and the flag and the gold star in the window, she was not alone, and that it was worth it. Whatever was coming, and she knew something was coming. She'd known since the second morning. It was worth it. They called it later in the quiet of her own heart. The season of grace. Though while it was happening, Ruth Calloway would not have dared give it a name at all, for fear of frightening it off. It was full autumn now. The oaks along the lane had gone to rust and gold, and the mornings came in cold enough to see your breath, and the whole farm turned that deep amber colour that the low sun makes at the end of the year. The colour it had been the evening the three of them met. The place changed under Amos Hartwell's hands, the way a face changes when somebody who loves it starts paying attention. He could not work fast. He could not work more than a few hours before the grey came up in him and he had to sit. But he worked steady, and he worked smart. And a man who has built barns for 40 years can do more sitting on a stool directing a 6-year-old than most sound men can do standing. The corn crib rose back up out of its own ruin. The porch step went firm underfoot. He patched the barn roof over the north stalls so the rain ran off clean, and he mended the henhouse so the fox couldn't get under it. And he oiled and sharpened and set to rights every tool in Daniel Calloway's lean-to until they hung on the wall in their rows again like something cared for. And everywhere he worked, the boy worked beside him, and Ruth learned the shape of her own days over again, learned to cook for 3, learned to listen for 2 voices in the yard, learned to lie down at night in a house that had somebody breathing in it besides herself. She fought it at first. Old habits of grief are the hardest habits there are to break, and Ruth had grieved so long and so hard that she'd half forgotten it was grief at all and started taking it for her natural self. She'd catch herself smiling and stop. She'd hear herself humming over the wash and go silent, startled, like she'd caught a stranger using her voice. There was a whole night in the 2nd week when she lay awake, certain she'd made a terrible mistake, that she'd opened the door and let the world back in. And now the world was going to do to her exactly what it had done before, which was to give her someone to love and then take him away. Because that was the one thing Ruth Calloway knew for certain about love, that it was only grief that hadn't happened yet. It was Amos who found her out. She'd come down before dawn to sit alone in the dark kitchen the way she used to before they came, and he was already there. He slept less and less now. The ache in his chest wouldn't let him lie flat, sitting at the table in the banked fire dark with a cup of the coffee he wasn't supposed to have. And he looked at her face in the dim, and he saw what was on it, and he said gentle, "You're thinking it'd hurt less if you'd never let us in. That you were safer before." Ruth didn't answer, which was its own answer. "I thought that too," Amos said. "After my Mary, I thought, I'll not love another thing on this earth. It costs too dear. I'll just get through my days." He turned the cup slow in his ruined hands. "And then my daughter put that boy in my arms, and I found out what a fool I'd been. Ruth." He waited till she looked at him. "The safe way and the dead way are the same road. I walked it 2 years after Mary before I saw it. You can keep the door shut and keep the hurt out, and you'll get to the end of your life, having felt nothing and lost nothing and been nothing. And that's not safe. That's just dying slow with the lights off." He reached across the table, slow, and laid one big trembling hand over her worn one. The first time he had touched her, and she let him. "You didn't make a mistake letting us in. The mistake would have been the other thing. The mistake's the thing you've been doing for 6 years." And Ruth Calloway, in the dark of her own kitchen, before the sun was up, finally told another living soul about Daniel. She hadn't meant to. It came out of her the way water comes out of ground that's been holding it too long, under too much weight, all at once, and more than she knew was in there. She told him about the boy who'd stood on that porch, waiting for his milk before bed, about how he'd grown up tall and easy and good with his hands like his father, about the day the recruiter's letter came, and how proud the boy had been, and how she'd smiled and packed his bag and waved him off down that same road Amos had walked in on, and how she'd stood at the gate long after the dust had settled with a cold stone in her stomach that never, from that day, entirely went away. About the flag, about the letter that said gallantry and said regret and said nothing that a mother could hold or bury or bring home. About her husband dead 3 winters before that, so there wasn't even another soul in the house to grieve alongside her. And how she'd taken the gold star out of the window, because every neighbor who saw it made a face she couldn't stand. The soft, pitying face, and how she'd shut the door that week and, in every way that mattered, had not opened it since, until 3 strangers' worth of hunger came up her road at sunset. 2 strangers. An old man and a boy. His name was Daniel, she said at the end of it, and it was the first time she had said the name out loud in 6 years, and it cost her, and it was worth what it cost. Daniel. He'd have been 41 this fall. Daniel, Amos repeated, careful, the way you repeat a name to show you'll keep it. Then there's been a good man's name gone unsaid in this house too long. He pressed her hand. We'll say it now and again, you and I. A name oughtn't go to silence. It's the second death, that is, worse than the first. Being forgotten. We won't do it to your Daniel. And Ruth, his voice went very low, you won't do it to me either. When my day comes, promise me the boy'll know my name and say it. That's all a man wants at the end. Just to not be a silence. I promise, Ruth said. Amos, I promise. Outside the window, the first grey light was coming up over the fine new fence. Part 6. The Things a Man Leaves. His boy Amos. Hartwell knew he was dying, and so he did a thing that ordinary fathers, believing they have time, almost never think to do. He set out deliberately to teach a 6-year-old a lifetime of things all at once. Ruth understood what he was doing before Eli did. She'd come around the corner of the barn and stop, and there they'd be. The old man on the milking stool, the boy standing between his knees, and Amos's big ruined hands guiding the small ones through some task, and the old man's voice going low and steady the whole time, teaching, always teaching. And it wasn't just the task. Underneath the task, there was always something else being handed down. Some rule for living folded inside the lesson like a coin baked into a cake. So the boy would find it years later when he was grown and needed it. Now, when you set a post, Amos would say, the boy's hands under his on the tamping bar, you dig deeper than looks needful. Always deeper than looks needful. A thing that's going to stand through storms. You don't set it by fair weather. You set it for the worst night it'll ever see. You understand me, Eli? Not just fences. Everything a man builds. You build it for the worst night. For the worst night, the boy repeated, not understanding, filing it away. That's right. Now tamp it down. Thin layers. You can't rush the setting of a thing. Everybody wants to, and everybody that rushes it, their fence goes over in the first wind. A pause. Same with trust, son. Same with love. You can't rush the setting of it. Thin layers and time, and it'll hold anything. He taught him to sharpen a blade. A dull tool's more dangerous than a sharp one. Remember that, the dull one slips, and to read weather in the sky, and to gentle a spooked animal by going slow and low and letting it come to you. He taught him his letters in the dirt with a stick, since there'd been no schooling on the road. Scratching out AMOS and RUTH and DANIEL and ELI in the yard, the boy sounding them out, the old man's finger tracing under each one. He taught him to whittle, and the boy's first crooked whistle pipe, made under Amos's hands, Ruth kept in her apron pocket for the rest of her life. He taught him how a man treats a woman. You fetch and you carry and you don't wait to be asked. And when she's tired, you're not. And when she's low, you're steady. And you never, ever raise your hand nor your voice. A man that has to shout has already lost the argument. And Ruth, hearing that one from around the corner, had to press her apron to her mouth. But mostly in those shortening amber afternoons, he taught the boy how to lose him. He did it gently. And he did it a little at a time, thin layers, the way he'd taught everything. He'd say of an evening, you know I'm an old man, Eli. And the boy would say yes. And Amos would say, and old men, they get to where they're tired and they go on ahead. That's all it is. Going on ahead to where it's morning already. And the ones that love us, we don't leave them. We just go on ahead and hold a place. And the boy would get quiet and press close, and Amos would hold him and let him be quiet, and not say any more that day. Thin layers. And the next week he'd add a little more. When I go on ahead, you'll stay here with Miss Ruth. This is your home now, you hear? Not the road. Here. You've got a home now, and a garden you weeded yourself, and a cow you can milk, and a woman that loves you like her own. You'll be all right. And the boy would say, Small, I don't want you to go on ahead. And Amos would say, I know it, son. I know it, but you'll be all right. I fixed the fence so it'll hold, and I fixed some other things too, and you'll be all right. That's a grandpa's whole job, to fix things so his boy's all right after. And I've done it. You're the best work these hands ever did, and I've set you deep, and you'll stand through the worst night. I promise you that. Ruth would find the boy afterward those evenings and hold him without a word, and the two of them were learning it together, how to lose the old man, the way he'd meant them to. Thin layers, time, so that when the wind finally came, it wouldn't take them over. The cold came on hard in the last week of November, and with it in the night. The sound Ruth had been listening for and dreading since the second morning. The sound of Amos Hartwell's breath going wrong in the next room. No longer just the deep, slow ache, but something rattling and shallow and afraid. The sound of a body that has run its water out and knows it. She was up and at his door before she was rightly awake. And the old man looked at her across the dark little room where they'd made him a bed by the stove so he wouldn't have to climb the stairs. And even now, even grey and gasping, he tried to make his face easy for her sake. "Ruth," he managed. I think it's the day, Ruth. I think it's come." And Ruth Calloway, who had not been able to sit at any deathbed since her husband's because she'd had no one to sit with, who had lost her son to a far country and never had a body to tend or a bed to sit by, Ruth Calloway lit the lamp with steady hands and woke the boy gentle, and sat down on the edge of the old man's bed, and took his big, ruined, trembling hand in both of hers, and did not leave it again, before I tell you how it ended, and it is not ended. There is one thing left that Amos Hartwell did that Ruth didn't know about yet. One last thing those ruined hands built that she wouldn't find until after. Let me sit here with you a moment. Friend, the way Ruth sat with Amos, because I know some of you watching have sat exactly where she's sitting. You've held a hand in a lamplit room and listened to breathing. You'd have given anything to keep going. Tell me down in the comments, whose hand did you hold? Say their name. Let's not let it go to silence tonight. Amos was right about that. Being forgotten is the second death, and it's the worst one. So say their name below and I'll say it with you. The old man had a few hours left, and he meant to use every one of them. He asked for the boy first. Ruth brought Eli to the bedside in his nightshirt, sleep-warm and frightened, and lifted him up onto the edge of the bed, the way you'd lift him onto a horse. Careful. And the boy looked at his grandfather's grey face in the lamplight, and his lip began to tremble, and Amos said, "None of that now. None of that, my Eli. Come here to me." And the boy leaned in, and the old man got one arm up around him, weak as it was, and held him, and Ruth stepped back to the wall and let them have it, and pressed her own knuckles to her mouth. "You remember what I told you," Amos said low into the boy's hair, "about going on ahead to where it's morning already," the boy whispered. "That's right. That's just right. And you remember I'm not leaving you. I'm going on ahead and holding a place. And someday, a long, long time from now, when you're an old man yourself, older than me, you'll come on up that road, and I'll be standing at the gate waiting, and I'll have it all fixed up nice for you. The fence'll be square, and the gate'll latch first try." His voice caught. "But not for a long time yet. You've got a whole life to build first down here, before you come on up that road. And you're going to build it good. You know how. I taught you how. Deep as looks needful and thin layers, and built for the worst night. You remember? Built for the worst night," the boy said, and he was crying now, quiet. The way his grandfather had taught him even that, how to weep without coming apart. "This is a hard night, Eli. Maybe the worst one. But you were built for it. I set you deep. You're going to stand." The old man pressed his lips to the boy's forehead and held them there a long moment. "Now, you go on with Miss Ruth a minute and let me talk to her, man to woman. And then you come back and you hold my hand and you don't let go till I've gone on ahead. Can you do that for me? Can you hold my hand and not let go? That's the last job I'll ever give you, son. And it's the most important one, and I'm giving it to you because you're the only one strong enough for it." "I can do it, Grandpa," the boy said. "I won't let go. I know you won't. You never have." Amos looked at him, memorizing him, the way the dying look at what they love. "You're the best of us, Eli Hartwell. Best of the whole line. Don't you ever forget I said so." Ruth carried the boy to the doorway and set him down and told him to fetch the good quilt, the wool one off the son's bed, and a small task, to give him a moment and a purpose. and she came back and sat down on the edge of the bed where the boy had been, and took Amos's hand again. "You've got something to say to me," she said. "Say it." Two things. His breath was shorter now, and he spent it careful, the way he spent everything. "First, under the floor of the barn, third stall, there's a board comes up. I put a tin box under it. There's papers in it, Ruth. I had the lawyer in town see to it 3 weeks back, when you thought I was going for liniment." The dry smile came one last time, ghost of itself. "Guardianship papers. Signed, witnessed, legal. That boy is yours. Nobody can come and take him. No county, no far cousin, nobody. I made sure. He's yours in the eyes of the law, same as he's been yours in the eyes of God, since about the second morning." He squeezed her hand with what strength he had left. "You didn't take on a stranger's grief for a season, Ruth. You took on a son. I made it so nobody could ever tell you different." Ruth couldn't speak. She bowed her head over his hand. "Second thing," his voice dropped to almost nothing and she had to lean close. "You said that night at the gate that you'd forgotten how to be a woman with a hand to give. You haven't forgotten anything, Ruth Calloway. I watched you these 3 months. There's more love banked up in you than in any soul I ever met. You just walled off the fire so long you forgot it was still burning. But it's still burning. That boy warmed his hands at it, and so did I." He drew a slow, rattling breath. "When I'm gone, you're going to want to wall it up again. It'll hurt, and the walling up is how you'll think you keep from hurting. Don't you do it. You promise me. You keep that door open. There'll be others come up your road that need what you've got. There always are in this hard world, and you let them in. You've got the room. Your Daniel had the room, and your Danelle's mother had the room, and it doesn't die when we do, that kind of room. It gets passed on. You pass it on. Promise me you'll pass it on." "I promise," Ruth said. "God is my witness, Amos. I'll keep the door open. I'll pass it on. Then I'm done." He let out a long breath and something in his ruined face eased, some load set down at last. "I walked a long way looking for a soft place to leave him. 11 counties. Got turned from every door." His eyes found hers and held. "And it was here. The last house on the road, with the broke fence, and the hard woman and the cup of milk. It was here all along. I just had to walk far enough to earn it." His hand tightened on hers. "Thank you, Ruth, for the milk, for the door, for being the place. God bless you. God keep you. You'll not be alone. I made sure of that too." The boy came back then, dragging the wool quilt, and Ruth lifted him up beside his grandfather, and the boy took the old man's other hand in both of his small ones, and gripped it and did not let go. Amos Hartwell died an hour before dawn, in his own bed, in his own home, with his boy holding one hand and the woman holding the other, and the lamp burning, and the fine new fence standing square in the dark outside the window against the worst night it would ever see. He went easy at the end. The rattling breath got slower and further apart, and the two of them held on and said his name. "Amos, Amos, we've got you." Amos, so that the last sound in his ears was his own name spoken by people who loved him. No silence, no second death, just his name and 2 warm hands. And then he was gone on ahead, to where it was morning already, to stand at the gate and wait. The boy did not let go of the hand until Ruth, gently, after a long while, unwound his small fingers from it. "You did your last job," she told him. "You did it perfect." He knew you never let go. Part 8. The grave on the hill. They buried him on the little rise east of the house, under the oak where the morning sun came first. Ruth chose the spot herself, and she chose it for a reason she didn't speak aloud. It was the same rise where she'd have buried Daniel if the war had ever sent Daniel home to bury. There was already one marker there, a plain stone she'd set years back with her son's name on it and no body under it. A grave for a boy who died in a country she'd never see. Now she dug a second grave beside it in the cold November ground, and it was hard digging for a woman alone, and she would not let the boy help beyond the carrying of small stones, and it took her the better part of a day. But she'd sat a deathbed at last, and now she'd dig a grave at last. and there was something in the hard bodily work of it that her long-damned grief had been starving for all these years. The chance to do the old human things, the tending and the digging and the marking, that she'd been robbed of when the only news of her losses came folded in an envelope. The preacher came out from town. A few neighbors came too, word travels in country places, and more than one of them stood at the graveside that grey afternoon and thought privately that they'd not known Ruth Calloway had it in her to take in an old dying stranger and his orphan grandson, hard as she'd gone these 6 years. They stood with their hats off in the cold, and the preacher said the words, and the boy stood between them holding Ruth's hand. Wearing a little coat, she'd sat up half the night cutting down from one of Daniel's old ones. And when the preacher asked, was there anyone who wished to say a word, Ruth Calloway stepped forward. His name was Amos Hartwell, she said, in her flat plain voice to the small grey gathering. He was a wagon-right 40 years. He built things to stand. He walked 11 counties with this boy, trying to find him a home before he died, and he got turned from every door but mine, and the only reason he got past mine was he offered to fix my fence for a cup of milk, and I was too curious to say no. A small sound went through the neighbors, not quite a laugh, the kind of sound grief makes when it's touched by something true. He was the finest man I've known since my husband. He taught this boy more in 3 months than most fathers manage in 20 years, because he knew he didn't have the 20 years, and he spent every hour like it was his last, because most of them were. Her voice held. She made it hold. He told me a man's whole wish at the end is just to not be forgotten. So I'll ask you all a thing. When you go home tonight, say his name at your own supper tables. Amos Hartwell. Tell your people there was an old man came through dying, with nothing in the world but a boy and a good pair of hands gone bad. And he gave away the last of his strength-building fences for strangers so his grandson would have a place to land. Say his name. Don't let him go to silence. That's all he wanted. That's all any of us wants, I think, when it comes down to it. And she stepped back and took the boy's hand again. And they lowered Amos Hartwell into the ground on the rise beside the empty grave of Daniel Calloway, 2 good men, one under the earth and one lost to a far country, laid side by side at last under the same oak. In the care of the same woman, the neighbors went home. The preacher went home, and Ruth Calloway and the boy walked back down the hill to the house in the early dark, hand in hand, and for the first time it was just the 2 of them. And the enormity of it settled over the both of them at the kitchen door. The old man was gone, and the house was quiet, and the season of grace was over. And now there was only the long, ordinary life to live without him. The boy cried himself to sleep that night, and Ruth lay down beside him on the little bed by the stove, Amos's bed, still smelling of him, and held him, and did not try to stop his crying, because Amos had taught her that too, in a way, that you don't wall it up, that you let it come in thin layers, and it sets and it holds, and you stand, and somewhere in the black middle of that first terrible night, the boy, half asleep, thick-voiced, said into the dark, "Miss Ruth, I'm here. Are you going to go on ahead too? And leave me?" And Ruth Calloway gathered him in close and said the truest and most frightening promise of her whole life. The promise that finished the walling off of her heart for good and threw the door open wide and let the whole hurting world back in to stay. Not for a long, long time, baby. Not till you're grown and tall and don't need me, and even then I'll only go on ahead and hold a place, like Grandpa. I'm not leaving you. You've got a home now, and a mama that loves you like her own, and that's forever. You hear me? That's the one thing in this world that's forever. I'm not going anywhere." And the boy let out a long breath, the way his grandfather had. The load set down and slept. Grief, Ruth had learned the first time, is not a wall that falls all at once. It is a thing that comes in weather. The first winter without Amos came in hard and stayed long, and the grief came with it. In weather, the way he'd said. There were bright, still mornings when the frost lay silver on the fine new fence, and the boy laughed at the barn cat, and the loss of the old man seemed like something that had happened a long time ago to somebody else. And then there were the grey afternoons when Ruth would come around the corner of the barn and see the empty milking stool and stop and have to stand there a minute with her hand against the wall until it passed. There were nights the boy woke crying for his grandpa and Ruth held him. There were nights Ruth lay awake herself, dry-eyed, staring at the dark rafters, missing the sound of another grown person breathing in the house, missing the low, steady voice at the kitchen table before dawn. Missing, she made herself admit it in the honest black of those nights, missing being known. For 3 months a man had known her, all the way down, the walled-off fire and all, and had not been frightened off by it. And now he was under the oak on the hill, and no living soul on earth knew Ruth Calloway that way again. That was its own particular grief, and she sat with it in thin layers, and it set, but it was different this time. That was the thing she came to understand, over that long first winter. The first time, Daniel, the flag, the letter, the grief had been a thing that walled her in. This time the same grief was doing the opposite work. Because this time she wasn't alone in it. This time, every time the weather came, there was a small, warm boy to hold, and holding him, she could not sink the way she'd sunk before. He needed her fed and up and moving. He needed breakfast, whether or not she had the heart for it. He needed his letters practiced and his coat mended, and his hurts kissed, and his questions answered. And the sheer, relentless dailiness of a child, the thing that would have crushed a younger, softer woman, was the exact thing that kept Ruth Calloway's head above the black water that winter. Amos had known it would. She saw that now. He hadn't only given her the boy as a gift to her. He'd given her the boy as a rope, knowing the water was coming. "You clever old man," she said out loud one morning. To nobody, to the frost on the window, and it was almost a laugh. And it was the first time she'd spoken to him since the hill, and after that she spoke to him often, the way country widows do, out at the fence or over the wash, telling him the boy's small news. It didn't feel foolish. It felt like keeping a promise. A name oughtn't go to silence. She found the rest of what he'd left in the deep of that winter, a little at a time. The way you find everything he'd made, in thin layers. The tin box under the third stall was where he'd said, and the guardianship papers were in it, exactly as he'd promised, signed and witnessed and true. So that when a man did come out in February, a thin, cold man from the county with a leather folder, asking after the orphaned Hartwell child, and was there proper provision, Ruth Calloway met him on her fine new porch step with the papers in her hand and watched his face fall, and sent him back down her road with nothing and stood at her gate afterward shaking, half with fury and half with a fierce triumphant love, thinking you tried to protect us even from that. Amos, even from the thin, cold men with the leather folders. You thought of everything, but it wasn't only papers in the tin box. There was a letter, folded small, in the old man's careful hand. He'd had schooling once. You could see it in the letters, even shaky as they'd gone. It was addressed on the outside fold, in printed capitals, so the boy could read it himself someday, for Eli when he is grown. Ruth did not open it. It was not hers to open. She put it in the cedar box at the bottom of the drawer she no longer kept shut, the box where Daniel's flag was, and Daniel's letter. And she thought that the two letters lying there together, the one that had walled her heart up, and the one that would someday open a grown man's heart wide, were a kind of picture of her whole life, and she shut the drawer gently on the both of them, to wait. And there was one thing more in the tin box, wrapped in a scrap of the old man's own shirt. It was small and hard, and when she unwrapped it, it was a whistle pipe, but not the crooked first one the boy had made, that she kept in her apron. This one was finished and true, and smooth as riverstone, carved all over with tiny work, a fence, and a cow, and a little house, and 3 figures standing at a gate, an old man and a woman and a boy. Amos had made it in his last weeks, when his hands could barely hold the knife, working at night, when the ache wouldn't let him sleep. There was a slip of paper with it. For Eli, it said, from his grandpa. So he'll remember he had a home before he even had one, and that a man can build anything, even out of what's broke. If he loves somebody enough. Ruth sat down on the cold straw of the barn floor with the little carved whistle in her 2 hands and wept the way she had not let herself weep since the hill. Hard and long and cleansing, the good weeping that comes not from despair, but from being loved past your own deserving. And then she dried her face on her apron, and she got up, and she carried the whistle into the boy, and she told him where it came from and what his grandpa had said. And she watched the child's face as he ran his small thumb over the tiny carved figures at the gate, the old man, the woman, the boy, and understood, young as he was, what he was holding. He wore it on a string around his neck from that day. He wore it, in fact, for the rest of his life. Part 10. What the boy became spring came. The way spring always comes, whether the heart is ready for it or not. The oaks on the rise leafed out green over the 2 graves. The garden the boy had first weeded that September went in again, bigger this year, the 2 of them planting it together on their knees in the warm dirt. And Ruth taught him the things Amos hadn't lived to teach, which is to say, the growing things, the woman's knowledge, the seed and the season, and she found a deep, quiet joy in it, in having someone to pass it to at last. The cow freshened, and there was a calf, and the boy named it. And there was milk enough now that Ruth set a cup of it on the sill some evenings, out of an old habit her heart had made, and never quite explained to herself why, except that it had all started with a cup of milk, and it seemed right to keep one going. The boy grew. He grew the way Amos had set him to grow, deep-rooted, and steady, and built for the worst night. Oh, he had his hard spells. Grief doesn't leave a child clean, and there were years, especially the young years, when the missing of his grandfather would come over him sudden and sideways and lay him low for a day. But he had what Amos had given him to stand on, and he had Ruth, and he had the home the old man had walked 11 counties to find him, and it held. It all held. Amos Hartwell had built it to hold, and it held. He went to the country school. Once Ruth had him old enough and caught up on his letters, and the teacher sent word home that the Hartwell boy was the steadiest hand with the little ones she'd ever seen. That when a small child cried, it was Eli who went and sat with them, quiet with a hand on their back, waiting for the bad spell to pass. He'd learned that at 4 years old, standing in a fence line, with his hand on a dying man's back, and it never left him. He was gentle the way only children who've known hard things young can be gentle. He was good with animals, and good with his hands, and good with grief, other people's grief, which he could sit with the way most people can't, unafraid, because he'd sat with the biggest grief of all before he was 7, and come out the other side knowing it doesn't kill you if somebody holds your hand. And he called Ruth Mama. Not right away. It came the way the Miss Ruth had come, sideways and all at once, one ordinary evening a year or so on, and Ruth's heart had stopped and then filled so full she had to leave the room. After that he called her Mama always, and she was, in every way, the law and God, and the daily doing of it, could make a person a mother. His Mama. Ruth Calloway, who had buried a son with no body under the stone, raised another woman's grandson into a fine, steady man on the same farm under the same oak, and if you had told her, that grey evening she stood on her porch with her arms crossed and a bottle of milk in her hand and 2 beggars at her fence, that this was what was walking up her road, she'd have laughed you off the place. She'd have shut the door. She was so glad to the end of her days that she hadn't shut the door, for Ruth kept her promise. Both promises. She never let Amos's name go to silence. The boy grew up knowing exactly who his grandpa was. The wagon-wright who built things to stand, who fixed a fence for a cup of milk and stayed to build a whole life. And the boy told the story to his own children someday, and they told it to theirs, so that Amos Hartwell got the only thing he ever asked for at the end, which was to not be forgotten, to not die the second death, to to have his name said at supper tables by people who loved him long after the first death took him. And Ruth kept the other promise too, the harder one, the one about the door. She never walled the fire up again. She'd learned. The safe way and the dead way are the same road, and Ruth Calloway had walked enough of it. She kept the door open the rest of her life, and the world, being the hard place it is, sent others up her road who needed what was banked behind that open door. There was a runaway girl, 2 winters on, half froze and terrified, that Ruth took in and fed and did not ask questions of until the girl was ready to tell them. There was a widowed hired man with no place to winter, and a pair of orphaned children from a burned-out farm 3 counties over, and once, memorably, a whole family put off their land who slept in Ruth's mended barn a month until they found their feet. The neighbors, who had once thought Ruth Calloway the hardest woman in the county, came in time to call her place the last house on the road, the one where nobody was ever turned away, where there was always a cup of milk and a dry stall, and a woman who'd look at you across her own table like you were worth feeding. She never told any of them it had a name in her own heart, that open door. She never told them she'd learned it from an old dying man who'd had to walk 11 counties to teach it to her. But she thought of him every time. Every single time somebody came up her road out of the hard world and she opened the gate instead of shutting it, she thought, "This is for you, Amos. This is me passing it on like I promised. The room doesn't die when we do. You were right. It gets passed on. The fence he built stood 40 years. The years went by the way years do on a farm, not in a straight line but in a circle, season folding into season. The same fence catching the same amber light every autumn evening, so that a life out there can feel like one long day lived over and over, until you look up one time and find that the boy is a man and the woman is old. Eli Hartwell grew up tall, taller than his grandfather, in the end, though he had the old man's big hands, and the old man's slow, careful way of setting them to a task, and the old man's habit of digging every post hole deeper than looked needful. He took to the wagon-right trade. There was a man in town who did wheel and harness work and took the boy on, and Eli had the gift for it in his blood, and his hands both, and he built things to stand, the way Amos had. But he never left the farm. He couldn't have said why in words, except that a man doesn't leave the place his people are buried, and the woman who raised him is growing old. And so he stayed, and worked his trade in town, and worked the farm at evening, and married a good, steady girl from 2 farms over, and brought her home to the last house on the road, and Ruth Calloway grew old. It came on her gentle, all told. She'd been a hard-used woman young. Grief ages you faster than years do. But the back half of her life, the half that started with a cup of milk and a broken fence, had been so much softer than the front half that she seemed almost to grow younger as she grew old, the lines of her face settling from the hard set they'd taken in the bad years into something worn and easy and often near to laughing. She kept her garden as long as her knees allowed, and then directed it from a chair on the fine mended porch, while Eli's wife did the kneeling. She held Eli's children on her lap, 3 of them in time, and told them the story, the way she'd promised, the whole story. The beggar at the fence, and the cup of milk, and the finest fence in the county, and the old man who built things to stand. Your great-grandpa, she'd tell them, walked 11 counties to find your papa a home. And he found it right here, this porch, this gate. He fixed that fence out there for a cup of milk, and then he stayed and built the rest of his life onto it. And every good thing you've got started with him being too proud to take the milk without earning it. And the children would look out at the old grey fence, still standing square after all the years, and try to imagine it, and half believe it was a story, and half know it was true. And every autumn, when the light went long and amber and the whole farm turned the colour it had been that first evening, Ruth's heart would turn back to it whole and clear, the way an old heart turns back, the sun going down behind the road, the old man's shadow climbing her porch steps, the boy who wouldn't look at the milk. She was an old woman now, older than Amos had been that evening, And she understood things about that evening now that she'd been too young and too walled up to understand while it was happening. She understood that Amos Hartwell had been terrified that evening, a dying man at the last door on his last road with a child's whole future riding on whether a hard woman said yes. She understood the courage it had taken him to say please. She understood, too, her own self better, that the reason she'd opened the gate, the real reason under all the reasons, was that she'd looked at that starving, dark-eyed boy and seen her Daniel at that age, waiting on this porch for his cup of milk, and some part of her that 6 years of grief hadn't managed to kill had said, "Quiet but sure, here is a chance to do it over. Here is a chance to keep one this time. Here is a boy the war can't have. She never did lose this one. She got to keep this one all the way." And she came to feel in her old age that Daniel had somehow had a hand in it, that her lost boy had somehow sent the old man and the child up her road, that first evening, out of the same tenderness that had made him a good man before the war took him. She had no evidence for it. It was an old woman's fancy, but she held it, and it comforted her. And who is to say an old woman is wrong about such things? The evening it came time for Ruth Calloway to go on ahead. She was ready. She was very old by then, and it was autumn, and the light was long and amber on the fence. She lay in the good bed upstairs, not the little one by the stove. She'd had them move her up where she could see the rise and the oak through the window, and Eli sat beside her, a grown man near 60 himself now, grey coming in at his own temples, holding her hand in his big careful ones. His children were in the house. His wife was in the house. The place was full of voices, the way it had been when she was a girl, the way it had been empty for the 6 long years that she tried never to think about any more. "You did every single thing you promised him," Eli told her. "Lo, the way you tell someone the accounting of their life when they're near the end of it and need to hear it squared. You never let his name go quiet. You kept the door open your whole life. You know how many people slept in that barn, Mama? You raised me up. You did it all. He'd be—" The grown man's voice caught the way the small boys used to. "He'd be so proud of you. He is so proud of you, I know it. He's standing at that gate right now with it all fixed up nice waiting. Fence square," Ruth murmured, smiling, her eyes closed. "Gate latches first try." "First try," Eli said. She was quiet a while. Then she said, "Eli, the letter in the cedar box." It's time. He'd never opened it. It had sat in the cedar box at the bottom of the drawer for more than 50 years, for Eli, when he is grown, in his grandfather's shaky printed capitals, and Ruth had told him about it when he came of age, and offered it to him then, and the young man he'd been had held it a long time, and then put it back and said, "Not yet. I'm not ready to hear him yet." And somehow the years had gone by, and he'd never felt ready, or never felt grown enough, because a boy who loses his grandfather at 7 never quite stops being that boy in the deep down place. But now his mama was dying, and she'd said it was time. And so Eli Hartwell, a grandfather himself now, older by decades than Amos had lived to be, took the folded letter from the cedar box with hands that shook the way the old man's had shaken, and he sat by the window in the long amber light with his mother's hand in his lap, and he opened it at last. And he read what the old man had written for him half a century before. "My boy Eli, if you are reading this, you are grown, and I am long gone on ahead. And I am sorry I could not stay to see the man you became. I know you became a good one. I set you deep. You were built for the worst night, and I never once doubted you'd stand. I want to tell you some things a grandfather tells a boy that I did not have the years to tell you slow. So I will tell you here all at once, and you must forgive an old man his hurry. Be good to Ruth. She saved us. I want you to know that though I fixed her fence, it was her that fixed us. She took in 2 beggars off the road when she had every reason in the world to shut her door. And she did it with a broke heart she'd kept walled up 6 years. And that is the bravest thing I ever saw a body do, braver than any soldier. Whatever she is to you by the time you read this, mother or grandmother or just the old woman who raised you, you honor her. She is the best of us, same as you. Build things to stand. Dig deeper than looks needful. You cannot rush the setting of a thing that matters. Not a fence, not a trust, not a love. Thin layers and time. You know this. I taught you this in a fence line before you were tall enough to see over it. And I am trusting it took, and when your own hard night comes. And it will, son, it comes for everyone. That is the one promise this world always keeps. You remember that you were loved. You remember there was an old man with ruined hands who thought you were the finest work he ever did, and who was not afraid to die because he knew he'd left you somewhere soft. You were not a burden, Eli, not one day of it. You were the reason I kept walking. A man will walk 11 counties and pass the end of his own strength for a thing he loves that much. You gave my last road a purpose. That is the greatest gift there is, boy, to give a dying man steps somewhere to go. I will be at the gate. I have it all fixed up nice. Take your time getting here, a long, long time, and build a good life, and be good to Ruth, and say my name now and again so I don't go to the silence. I love you, son. I always did. I always will. That doesn't stop. That is the one thing that doesn't stop. Your grandpa, Amos Hartwell Ely. Hartwell sat by the window with the letter in his shaking hands and wept the way he had not wept since he was a small boy on a cold barn floor. And his mother, old and near the end and smiling, reached over and rested her hand on his bowed grey head, the way she had first rested it on his small dark hair at a fence gate 60 years before, and she said, "There he is. There's your grandpa. I told you he never went to silence. He's been right here the whole time." And she closed her eyes, still smiling, her hand on the head of the boy she'd raised. In the house, the old man had saved under the amber light on the fence that still stood square after all the years. And whose hand did you hold? At the end, or whose hand held yours? Amos Hartwell said the second death is being forgotten, and that it's the worse one, and that no name ought to be let go to silence. So before you go tonight, do the thing Ruth did at the graveside all those years ago. Say their name down in the comments. The mother, the father, the husband, the wife, the grandparent whose hand you held, write their name below, and let all of us here say it with you, so that tonight at least, in this one place, not a single one of them goes to the silence. I'll be reading every name, and I'll say everyone, because that old man was right about the whole of it. The safe way and the dead way are the same road. Love costs exactly everything, and it is worth exactly everything, and the only thing in this hard world that doesn't stop, not with distance, not with years, not even with death, is the love that got passed on. Amos passed it to Ruth, Ruth passed it to Eli, Eli passed it to his children, and they to theirs, and somewhere out there tonight it is still being passed. Hand to hand, door to open door, cup of milk to cup of milk. It started with a beggar at a broken fence, too proud to take the milk without earning it. It never ended at all.